I start with this rather an interesting picture. It's not because I couldn't find any other ones, but because the beginning of this presentation is going to be quite difficult. And the reason for it is that sometimes I give presentations and I know them fully by heart and I sort of run through them and I know exactly what follows upon the other. But this is a bit of a thinking presentation and I do it for the first time, so I really appreciate it if you think with me and afterwards tell me whether it makes sense what I'm saying. What I'm trying to do is reflect on the way museums work, the way museums collect objects and what they do with it. I want to talk about the reuse and afterlife of objects, and I want to, in the slipstream of that, talk a little bit about souvenirs. And my main thesis for today, and my question is, it seems that a museum is a ceremonial burial ground for objects. And my question is there an alternative? Could the museum also be in between objects, or in between a product and an object? And I start with this sword because there's an essay written by a literary historian, Philip Fisher, in the early 1990s, and it is about a sword. It starts with a story about a sword, and it tells you this, and you'll all recognize this probably. The sword, this is a medieval sword, it's probably a 7th century sword, is used by, at one point in time, at the beginning of its life, it's used by a warrior. And the warrior puts on the sword the marks of the number of people that he has killed. It is linked to his personality, and it will stay with him, and he gets buried with him, unless he loses in a war, and then or he dies in a war, and then somebody else will take it with him. Then Philip Fisher says, once the sword gets out of the community of the warrior, you'll see that very often these objects can get a new life in, for instance, a community where they revere the sword as something of another tradition and another civilization. And perhaps people have processions with pillows and they put the sword on it, and people maybe can sometimes touch it so that they can heal from all their wounds or their diseases. So it takes an entirely different meaning in this new community. And then perhaps afterwards, when this community is looted by yet other people, the sword gets in the hands of yet another community who will think that the sword is so old and so important and has so many stories that it ought to go to a museum. Now what we learn from that is objects really are or derive their meaning from the communities that use them. And the logical extension of that is that, and the thing that I want to be thinking about with you today, is that the production of meaning of what the sword is stops when it gets to a museum. Because what do we do in a museum? We actually start relating all the previous stories that the sword had meaning about, and the communities that it was part of. So we say again, once it belonged to a warrior, and then it became part of a priest ceremony, and then it became maybe yet in another group. But the museum doesn't attach itself a new value. It doesn't create a community in which the object gets its own meaning. And I think that is the reason why a museum is a ceremonial burial ground. We do know what it used to be for, but there it stops. Okay, let's get back to the basics. This is a museum you all very well know, and this is, I think, the quintessential image of what we all think the museum is. Now this slide is very dark, but I don't know, maybe you've seen the, I got it, it's a still from Indiana Jones. You probably know, for the ones who've seen Indiana Jones movies here, that it always starts or ends with the place where all the treasures that are found are stored. And this is what the backside of our museums look like. Often we have no idea what we've collected over the years and what the things were for. Now, if we come to think why museums are these burial grounds, then we have to go back to the history of the museums. This is the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And I think it's very important to understand that the whole history of the museum is wrapped up with the idea that we collect past achievements and show ourselves to be on the shoulders of those achievements. We are the end result. Our civilization is the end result of everything that we collect for a museum. So the museum is actually a celebration of our own culture and own civilization in a way. So whether we collect dinosaur bones, or whether we collect medieval glass, or whether we collect modern paintings, it all is to say this came before us and this is where our civilization is now. So maybe you can understand there's no future in that kind of thinking, because it's the end, always the end result of things. Now this is Demolition Depot in New York, and I show you this because they only sell irreplaceable objects here. This is what they also say, or irreplaceable artifacts. Everything you buy here cannot be replaced. It's actually a definition of what you have in a museum, right? There's no other thing like it. And the interesting thing of it is, if you think about it, our idea of what a museum is that it has a discourse that is entirely away from the market. It is important for us to always in our discourse say, we have the market, and it is about work, and it is about production, and you have the museum, and the museum is about contemplation and silence. We want to be separate from the market. We don't want to produce anything here, we just want to be quiet. Now those are two conditions already. We are at the end result of a civilization, and we want to be silent in the museum, and we organize everything around these precious objects that we collected. This is, by the way, the Columbia Museum in Köln. Now, if you can't produce, and if you can't reuse objects, and if they don't have afterlives, the result will already soon be that so let's say, you have your rhythm or your routine of you have a product in society, it becomes very scarce. So you bring it to a museum before it disappears altogether, so you withdraw it even more from the market, you isolate it, and then the only next step you can do to bring it back on the market is reproduce it for the tourist industry. And this is what our museum souvenir industry is about, right? All the production comes before the museum, and after the museum you have only reproduction. So you have the Venus of Milo, the Louvre, then it comes to the museum, and out comes the t-shirt. And there's many variants we can think of. Hans, to my surprise, showed this slide already before. I have some more. This is again Vincent van Gogh. It's not because either of us is, I think, great Vincent van Gogh fans, but the tourist industry around Vincent van Gogh is just absolutely astonishing. So I'll just show you a few things with at the end, with the pussycat and the sunflowers. Now, I have nothing against this tourist industry. And I think that all the museums that want to sell these souvenirs and make a good profit out of it should be really happy. But there's one thing that I would like it not to do, and that is to bear the avenue for alternative ways to think about souvenirs, to think about production after the museum instead of before. And the reason why I think that is because we all agree that museums are to some extent silent and contemplative institutions. But we also really want museums to be of our time. We really want museums to be engaged in the things that we engage in and address our issues. And if we keep dealing with the museum as the end result of everything, and nothing else can come out of it culture-wise except for reproduction, what we're actually saying is that on the end of the line of production is the museum, and after that all culture is secondary. You can only reproduce it. And I think that's a bad statement about living culture. Now I want to go a little bit in this talk with you about what would be the possibilities of connecting more to the living culture and think differently about what objects are and what kind of experience we have in museums. This is then the Tate. I've shown it already yesterday morning, I think. Why do I bring up the Tate? Because the Tate is an example of a very public-minded museum. It's very important for the Tate to show to people that yes, we have a beautiful art collection, and yes, we have beautiful exhibitions, and yes, we have spectacular shows in Turbine Hall, but more importantly, yes, you're all welcome here with whatever you like to come and meet other people and talk about the things that you like to talk about. The museum is a really public space. We've also seen, or also talked about Flickr beforehand. There's all kinds of social networks and social media that strengthen our idea that the new museum can be part of a much larger sort of network and a much larger public space. And if we have this new public space and we start conversing in that new space, you can see that it's totally away from the old idea as the museum that is only a place to store things and then to look at it and with objects that you can only appropriate or view or interpret that you cannot use. Second, if a museum can deal with living culture in more ways than one and more than it did before, it has suddenly a connection to a public where also funding opportunities and all kinds of links to the public can be established that couldn't be established before. And third, you can think about a totally new merchandise plan if you make the museum more actual, more of this time, more addressing the issues that we, the public, would like to see in museums. All right, and now is the difficult part coming. No, actually the first part was more difficult. Now I'll go to some examples. The question is, of course, can we really pose an alternative way of thinking about the museum as the end institution, and can we think of, in a way, the museum as a plant? You put a product in from society, be it a scarce product, you swallow on it, you work on it, you design on it, you have artists deal with it, and out comes yet a new product. And you can only see the museum in this part as a temporary stage of objects. Now, if we are willing to entertain that thought, now one thing is very important. We need to see the museum not as a static institution where only objects are shown. Two, if we deal with objects, I think we need to see that we only collect objects because we want stories and experiences into the museum. And three, if you are willing to entertain that thought with me, then we can think only on the basis of these two thoughts, think of a transformed experience in the museum. Let me show you a few examples. How am I for time? Does anybody have a watch? What time is it? All right, I'm going to go a bit slower then. Okay. This is not what you think it is, I hope. We have a peculiar thing in the Netherlands, but maybe you have it in Russia too. We have great battles in the past, and then once every so often, people all get together and reenact that battle. This is now the reenactment of the Battle of Grol. It's a very small town in the east of the country, and nobody really would know where to find it, except for about 50,000 people who go there every other year to reenact this battle. And the interesting thing is, if you look at it closer, you see people fighting, and it looks really real. But you see here people on the bottom that are just being the public, and they take it very seriously. So people come, they buy some gunpowder, and they put on their best uniforms, and they fight with each other because the buttons on their costumes aren't right, or whatever, or the sword is too heavy, or there's all kinds of stuff going on. From all over Europe, people come with horses and stuff. Do you know this in Russia? You have this too? Okay. So it's very serious business, and it's very interesting because it's really people like you and me that just have are interested in history and interested in doing, experiencing history by doing it again, trying to do exactly as it was 300 years ago. It's of course an illusion, but it's very, very interesting phenomenon. Now, one of the projects for the National History Museum was to send a historian and an artist to the reenactment of Grol. And you can't read this very well, so I'll show you only one of them. But what he did is he drew several pictures of what he saw. So he saw people fighting. He had all the historical information, so he knew what the fight was about and who was performing what role in that fight. But he also saw the public, and he also saw the new city. So he saw like tram lines and traffic lights and fighting 17th century soldiers on the field, and this was all together, and he made a mix of various historical layers, and you can see that here in the middle is the town. And I asked him to make a series of drawings so that I could make a room with wallpaper. Because the thing is, what these drawings do, and I'm sorry you can't really read it from here, but people who are in drawing rooms, they really start to look at all kinds of details and start to see what's going on. And I said it would be really important to make these wallpapers of all kinds of historical situations, but you can think of any other subject that you can do this with, and make rooms that you replace every 6 months. You just do a new wallpapering of the room, and you can actually sell the wallpaper as well to people who are interested in specific historical things. But of course, it doesn't need to be history. It could be geography. It could be anything else. And you can say you can make your own white drawing room at home if you want to have the experience for a few months of a particular reenactment, for instance, like this. That's something else than a museum souvenir, isn't it? All right, this is then a second drawing. This one I'm doing very fast because my TEDx will be on the national vending machine, so I'm just going to sort of run through it. We thought, wouldn't it be nice to speak to people about what a historical object is? And we talked, long about it and had long lists of objects, but we finally made this machine, and tonight I'll tell you everything about it, but the basic thing was that in this machine you could get a historical snack. You put a coin in and you take an object out and you bring it home, and it had museum labels to say when this object came into the life of the Dutch and what it was doing there, and then you could bring it home and you created a website profile, and people got all into conversation about what these objects were and what they meant in their lives, and shared stories about it. So here you see some happy people using it. It was a portable machine and it traveled all through the Netherlands. And it's also a very different thing from a regular museum souvenir, because basically it was a product before it came to the museum, and it was the same product after, that people could just bring it home. Oh, sorry, you have some sound? Or we made short video clips with every one of the objects.
Als ik tweemaal met mijn fiets bel, nou dan weet je het wel, nou dan weet je het wel. Als ik tweemaal met mijn fiets bel, dan betekent dat kom snel.
Alright, tonight I have another one that's even funnier than this one. So think about the idea of that. Basically all the culture around this can be brought into a museum and can be brought out of the museum again as well. The museum just has to think of the right vitrine to bring it out with. So these things you can find in all kinds of stores, but if you put them in a machine and then bring them somewhere else, then people will get suddenly very interested in what they are. Alright, now I have my Russian example. Can you make this film work? Does it work? Oh, that's a pity. Can you get this back? I'll work with the photo. Okay, let me tell you in the meantime. Last year we were brought with this group to Kulikovo Field, and you of course know Kulikovo Field all very well because it's the, how would you call it, the birthplace of the Russian nation, right? Okay. And we were there, and it was, oh look at that. It's with my mobile phone, so it's not such a good film. Can you maximize it? It's on the left underneath. Oh. No, that's another one. We need the next. Alright, so we went to Kulikovo Field. Who have been in Kulikovo Field? Well, just one person. Alright, I thought every school class in the entire Russia went there. Okay, so we saw a chapel and a church and a small museum and a huge monument, and they all were, let's say, the traditional reflex on what to do when you have a historically very important space and you want to start a museum. But now, with Kulikovo Field, there's a difficulty, because Kulikovo Field has a lot of historians saying, well, maybe this isn't really the famous battle in which the Russians beat the Tartars, maybe the Russians were beating another group of people, or maybe the Russians weren't even involved, maybe the Tartars weren't involved. We don't actually know whether it was a faction strife or whether it was a national thing. And last but not least, we're not sure it was here that the fight, if there was a fight, that it was here. And there's some historians that in fact claim that the fight was right here in Moscow. So what did they do in Kulikovo Field? They decided that what they couldn't do is make all these historians go away and say that Kulikovo Field was a battlefield and they didn't know anything about it further. We just did, like in 1380 or whatever it was, this battle was. But instead, they decided we're going to recreate the battlefield in terms of flowers. So they brought botanists and landscapists and historians and biologists and said, we want to recreate this battlefield exactly as it would have been if the fight would have taken place there. So you can, as a visitor, you can walk through it and you can think, maybe you can think, oh, this is an hour before the battle, this is exactly what it looked like. Or you can think, maybe if I look very closely, this is a day or 2 days after the battle and I can still find some blood. Or you can just enjoy nature and say, this is what a landscape in 1380 looked like. And I found it a really beautiful poetic gesture. Now that's the product end of it, right? That's the object. And it's the object of which I said before, this is about experience. Now, I'll bring you to another, can I still... The color is not so good, but really, it's really lovely. All right, we'll go to the next. Can I? Yeah, that one. Okay, so hold the thought that you have a landscape that you recreated to look like the 1380s with beautiful flowers, and it was really lovely. It was June also, so we were all really happy there. And while we were on excursion and doing museum business and stuff, it was really lovely. Now, this is an artist in the Netherlands, Beerte Leemeijer, and she was asked by a local region in the Netherlands to think about a project, design a project that would deal with the fact that there was a very, very old medieval polder. It's the eastern part of the Netherlands. You know what a polder is, right? It's basically agriculture land for, in this case, cows and stuff. And the polder was vanishing because the cities around it started to grow more than they did before. And they asked the artist, can you do something to bring back the old area? And she went and talked to a lot of farmers there, and she said, so what is the essence of this region? What do you think about? And while they were brainstorming, they decided that essence is also the word for perfumes. And they said, can we think of what the scent would be that people would recognize as really from this region? And they worked on it and worked on it, and finally they made the essence of Mastenboek. Mastenboek is the name of the polder. And it's really very nice perfume. I mean, it's like, you know, it has to do with dried grass and with all kinds of things that you think, well, you know, that doesn't smell very good. But the scent is very beautiful, it's very, it smells very good, and it was launched at a really big department store in the Netherlands, and it's being sold all over the world. Now I thought, wouldn't it be nice if you work with landscape and history, and if you think of preserving that landscape, to also think on the other end of the museum and make perfume out of it, and try to sell that and bring it back into the market and say, okay, this is then an essence of a region that you can bring back, you can make new objects of, you can produce. All right, the last already. Example. At the Zeus Museum, where the woman before was referring to, in Middelburg, we had a huge collection of traditional costume, folkloric costumes. And here you can see this is a folkloric costume show. People are still wearing it, but only on ceremonial days. And there's like 170 old women that still wear the real stuff because they think, you know, this is their identity. And when I came to the Zeus Museum, everybody said, you know, all that old stuff, we don't like it. It's all grey and black, and here and there a bit of colour, but we really, really find it totally boring. And young people are totally uninterested in this whole topic. So I formed a team, and I said, there's only one thing that you need to solve for me. Why are people always unhappy and dissatisfied with presentations of folkloric costumes? And are these very same people always very happy to see fashion on a catwalk? But analyze for me what the difference is between fashion in the folkloric sense and fashion in the catwalk sense. Because it's both, of course, to a historian or a sociologist, it would be the same thing. It's just another context in another time. So can you bring that together? I have one more slide. Can you show me one more slide? To give you an idea what these people were protesting against. Yeah, it's that very red one. The colors are a bit different than in real. So these are the kind of presentations you get then. There's like, it's very difficult to see, but you have like all kinds of puppets, and you have like old materials and folkloric things and stuff. We know that, right? It's the same in Russia. This is how you present this kind of stuff. And I said, I want to totally dispense with all that. I don't want to see any puppets. So let's try to go and see what we can do with real people and let them wear it and let them, let's try to have the audience feel what it is to wear these costumes, what it looks like, and what the bodily and maybe even to some extent sexual part of clothing and bodies is, because we had some really beautiful clothing that were really specially made for the fair, and the fair was the once in a year thing in Ceylon where you would get a maid, so you'd be, you know, best dressed and maid, I mean girl or woman, best dressed, and you would walk around and bounce around and show who you were. So if it's going to work, so far so good. Will you have the film for me? She'll try. I'll show you this film and then. So you have to close this one, I think, if you can. There we go.